The poor black boy the whole town rejected once made a promise to the white girl who fed him. "One day, I'll come back rich, and I'll marry you." At the time, she just laughed. 20 years later, he returned with millions of dollars, and the entire town suddenly wished they had treated him differently. Back then, however, Malik Carter was only 10 years old, hungry enough to feel pain in his stomach with every breath. Malik was a thin black boy with sharp eyes, cracked lips, and a silence that made adults uneasy. Since his mother had died 3 weeks earlier, he had been drifting through the poorer blocks of Birmingham, sleeping wherever the cold led him, learning quickly that grief did not soften people. If anything, it made them look at him harder, as if loss itself had made him dangerous. That Monday morning, he stood outside the chain-link fence of Jefferson Elementary School. Children laughed on the playground. Lunch trays clattered inside the cafeteria. Malik stood still, both hands wrapped around the wire, staring at the food with the hollow concentration of a child who had gone too long without eating. His sweater was too small, his sneakers were split at the sides, and the November wind moved through him like he was hardly there. Mrs. Dobbins, a fourth-grade teacher with a stiff back, a neat gray skirt, and the kind of face that rarely bent toward kindness, spotted him first. She hurried across the yard and clapped her hands for attention. "Children, stay away from that fence," she said. "Do not speak to strangers, especially boys like that, understood?" A few students nodded at once. Some obeyed because they were scared. Others obeyed because adults had taught them that fear and judgment were the same thing. By the sidewalk, 2 mothers waiting near the pickup gate lowered their voices, though not enough. "That's the same boy from Friday," one whispered. "Mm-hmm," said the other. "Kids like that grow up fast and never into anything good." 9-year-old Emily Harper heard every word. Emily was a small white girl with bright, observant blue eyes and a habit of thinking before she spoke. She wore her blonde hair in 2 loose braids, and though she was gentle by nature, she had a quiet stubbornness that came from her grandfather more than anyone else. Her lunchbox hung from one hand, but her attention stayed fixed on the boy beyond the fence. He did not look dangerous to her. He looked tired. He looked scared. He looked hungry. Emily shifted uneasily. She remembered her grandfather, Walter Harper, an elderly man with weathered hands, a calm voice, and the moral backbone half the town lacked. Just the week before, he had told her, "A person's worth is not in their skin, Emily. It's in their soul, and in how we choose to see them." Now, standing in the schoolyard, Emily realized the adults around her were choosing not to see Malik at all. Her friend Clara tugged at her sleeve. "Come on," Clara whispered. "Mrs. Dobbins said don't go near him." Emily didn't move. Malik lifted his eyes for one brief second, and that was enough. There was no anger in them, no threat. Only a terrible, aching hunger no child should ever carry alone. Her fingers tightened around the handle of her lunchbox. For the first time in her life, Emily Harper stepped away from the crowd and toward the fence. And when she stopped in front of him, her voice came out small but clear. "Are you hungry?" Emily Harper did not wait for courage to find her. The moment she saw the hunger in Malik Carter's eyes, she opened her lunchbox with trembling fingers and pushed her sandwich through the gap beneath the chain-link fence. Then she added the small carton of milk. Malik stared at the food, then at her, suspicion tightening every muscle in his thin body. He was a 10-year-old black boy who had already learned that kindness often came with a trap. Emily, a 9-year-old white girl with soft braids and a stubborn, quiet heart, held his gaze and said, "It's okay. I'm not going to take it back." For a second, he did not move. Then hunger won. He grabbed the sandwich and ate so fast it made Emily's chest ache. He drank the milk in 3 long swallows without once looking away from her, as if he still expected someone to yell at him for existing. The next day, Emily came back, and the day after that. At first, Malik barely spoke. He accepted the food with guarded eyes, his thanks almost silent. He had spent too long being watched with suspicion to believe a girl like Emily would keep returning for no reason. But she did. Every lunch period, she found a way to slip away from the others and bring him whatever she could spare. Half a sandwich, crackers, an apple, sometimes milk. Soon her classmates noticed. Clara, who had once only looked nervous, now laughed with the others. "Emily's got a new friend," one boy mocked. Another said it louder. "The black boy outside the fence." Some of the children copied the ugly tone they had heard from adults without even understanding its cruelty. Emily's face burned every time, but she refused to answer them. Instead, she carried her lunch to the fence and sat close enough that Malik would know she had come back again. At home, the whispers followed her in a different form. Noah Harper, Emily's older brother, was 12, restless and eager to sound grown. He repeated things he heard men say at church and on front porches, never realizing how cruel they were. When Emily came home one afternoon, with only an empty milk carton in her bag, Noah smirked and said, "You better stop feeding that boy. Mom says strangers bring trouble, and boys like him always do." Emily snapped before she could stop herself. "You don't even know him." Noah shrugged, more confused than malicious, but Emily stormed away anyway, furious that the world had filled his mouth with words that did not belong to him. By the end of the week, Rose Harper began to notice. Rose, Emily's mother, was a hard-working woman with tired eyes, careful manners, and the cautious instincts of someone who had learned to survive by avoiding trouble. She watched Emily come home every day, hollow-eyed and hungry, eating too fast at supper. On Friday evening, Rose opened Emily's lunchbox while rinsing dishes and found only untouched napkins and crumbs. "Emily," she said gently, "why do you keep coming home starving?" Emily froze. For a moment she considered lying. Instead, she lowered her head and told the truth. Rose's face changed. Not hard, not yet, but troubled, as if fear and pity were arguing inside her. The following Monday, Emily returned to the fence again, this time with an extra piece of cornbread wrapped in wax paper. Malik took it more slowly, his hands less shaky than before. "Why do you keep doing this?" he finally asked. Emily sat cross-legged in the dirt and thought about it. "Because you're hungry," she said, as if that should have been enough for anyone. Malik looked at her for a long moment, and something in his face softened. Emily started telling him about school that day, how Clara had misspelled elephant, how Mrs. Dobbins hated loud voices, how the class goldfish had somehow survived another weekend. For the first time, Malik's mouth twitched. Then, suddenly, he laughed. It was small and rusty, like a sound his body had forgotten how to make, but it was real. Emily laughed too, partly from relief, partly because she realized she had just heard something no one in town had probably bothered to earn from him in a very long time. Day by day, their silence became conversation. Malik still flinched when teachers walked by and still checked over his shoulder whenever adults gathered near the gate. But he no longer looked at Emily as if she were playing a trick on him. He looked at her like she was exactly what she seemed to be. Not a savior, not a miracle, just one white girl in a town full of judgment who had chosen to see him as a hungry child instead of a threat. And for Malik Carter, that was the first kindness that felt real enough to trust. Winter arrived hard in Birmingham, creeping through alleys, under porches, and into the bones of anyone who had nowhere warm to go. Malik Carter had survived hunger before, but cold was different. It made his hands stiff, His lips split open, and his cough worse each day. Emily Harper noticed it before anyone else did. Emily, still only 9, had begun paying attention to the smallest changes in him. The way he wrapped his arms tighter around himself, the way he shivered even when pretending he was fine. So one morning, she pushed more than food through the fence. She handed him a wool scarf the color of faded red and a pair of old gloves that had once belonged to Noah. Malik stared at them in disbelief. He looked at Emily as if asking whether this was another test, another joke, another moment that would turn cruel the second he reached for it. But Emily only said, "Take them. You need them more than we do." The cold deepened, and so did Malik's cough. By then, Rose Harper had stopped pretending not to notice. Rose, a careful woman shaped by fear and habit, had listened to Emily's soft confessions at the kitchen table and spent several nights wrestling with herself. What finally changed her was not a speech or a sermon, but one brief look through the schoolyard fence one gray afternoon. She saw Malik bent over, coughing so hard he had to grip the chain links just to stay standing. He looked less like danger and more like a child the world had forgotten on purpose. That evening, Rose said nothing during dinner. But later, she folded an extra blanket, set aside cold medicine, and left both on Emily's bed. It was her quiet surrender. The next day, Emily carried them to the fence with trembling pride, and Malik accepted them with red, fever-bright eyes that could barely hold open. On the worst nights, help came from somewhere else, too. Pastor James Holloway, an older black pastor with a deep voice, tired shoulders, and kind eyes sharpened by years of witnessing pain, found Malik huddled behind the fellowship hall one evening after Bible study. Pastor James had seen boys like him before, children swallowed by grief and neglect, then blamed for surviving it poorly. He did not ask too many questions. He only opened the church basement, gave Malik a cot, hot soup, and 2 nights of shelter when the temperature dropped close to freezing. On the third afternoon, when Emily saw Malik looking less pale than usual, he told her in a halting voice about the pastor. Then, after a long silence, he confessed something else. "The hunger hurts," he said, staring at the dirt by his shoes. "But not as much as the way people look at me. Like I'm already bad. Like I'm nothing." Emily's throat tightened. She was too young to fix the world, but not too young to hate what it was doing to him. So she answered the only way she knew how. Emily sat close to the fence, the winter wind tugging at her braids, and looked at Malik with complete seriousness. "One day," she said, "they're going to be sorry." Malik glanced up. Emily's voice was small, but her certainty was not. "One day, they'll wish they hadn't treated you like this." For the first time, Malik seemed to imagine that future with her. He touched the scarf around his neck and gave a tiny nod, as if her faith had become a fire he could warm his hands over. The days that followed were quieter, heavier somehow, as though both children could sense something was coming. Mrs. Dobbins watched the fence more often. Strange cars began pulling up near the curb. Once, Malik mentioned a woman asking questions about him downtown. Emily tried not to feel afraid, but fear settled in her chest anyway. It happened on a Thursday afternoon. A county social worker arrived just before lunch, a tall woman in a navy coat with a clipboard tucked under her arm. Her name was Denise Walker, and though her voice was gentle, there was no mistaking what she represented. Change, removal, an ending. She told Malik they had found temporary placement for him and that he had to come now. Emily reached the fence just as Malik stood frozen in the winter light, torn between terror and hope. For 1 second, he looked like he might run. Instead, he turned to her. His fingers slipped through the chain links, and Emily took his hand. It was cold, rough, and shaking. Malik swallowed hard, his eyes wet but determined. "One day," he said, his voice breaking, "I'll come back rich, and I'll marry you." Emily blinked, then laughed through her tears because it sounded impossible and solemn and exactly like something only a child could promise with his whole heart. Before Denise could lead him away, Emily reached to her neck. She wore a small silver necklace with a star charm, a gift from Walter Harper on her last birthday. With clumsy fingers and sudden certainty, she pulled it free, bent the charm apart at its weak center, and pushed one half through the fence. "Then keep this," she whispered. Malik took the broken half like it was something holy. Emily kept the other piece closed in her fist as he was led toward the waiting car. Neither child understood how much that small, damaged star would come to mean. But from that day on, it became the thread tying one lonely black boy and one brave white girl across distance, time, and every promise the world expected them to forget. 20 years changed everything the world could see about Malik Carter. At 30, he was no longer the starving black boy outside a school fence in worn-out shoes and a torn sweater. He was the founder of Carter Axis Technologies, a fast-rising security software company that had made him millions and turned him into a national success story. Business magazines praised his discipline. News anchors called him proof that hard work could overcome anything. In photographs, Malik looked composed, sharp, expensive, tailored suits, steady eyes, a voice that made boardrooms go silent. But success had not erased memory. It had only dressed it better. Beneath the polished image was the same boy who had once stood shivering outside Jefferson Elementary, learning that in Birmingham, poverty made people dismiss you, and blackness made them fear you. On the morning he flew back to Alabama, Malik opened the private safe in his penthouse study before touching anything else. Inside, among legal documents and investment records, rested a small velvet box. He lifted it carefully and opened it with the same reverence he had carried for years. Half of a silver star pendant lay inside, slightly bent, dull with age, but still unmistakable. Emily Harper's half. Malik ran his thumb over the jagged edge where it had broken apart and felt the old ache return with brutal clarity. Some men carried lucky coins or family watches. Malik carried a promise. He had built companies, survived rooms where no one expected him to belong, and learned how to turn humiliation into ambition. But he had never stopped wondering what became of the little white girl who had once seen him as human before the world thought he deserved that dignity. The official reason for his return was bold enough to fill headlines. Malik announced a major redevelopment initiative in Birmingham: mixed-income housing, business incubators, youth centers, and technology training facilities in neglected parts of the city. Investors applauded. Reporters called it visionary. City officials smiled for cameras and praised his commitment to urban renewal. But behind closed doors, Malik's motives were split cleanly in two. Yes, he wanted to build something lasting, but he had also come back to find Emily Harper. Quietly, without fanfare, he had already hired researchers to search school records, public filings, legal directories, and voter databases for her name. He never admitted that part aloud. It sounded too personal, too soft for the ruthless image the business world preferred. Still, every time someone mentioned Jefferson Elementary or the old neighborhood, Malik's attention sharpened in a way no deal ever managed to command. That same softness had shaped another part of his life no one in the press fully understood. For years, Malik had quietly funded shelters, scholarship programs, and transitional housing for homeless black teenagers in cities across the South. The donations rarely carried his name. He preferred it that way. He knew what it felt like to be 15 with nowhere safe to sleep, to be judged before speaking, to be treated like a problem rather than a child. One nonprofit director in Atlanta called her anonymous donor a man who never forgot what the street takes from boys. She did not know how true that was. Whenever Malik signed another wire transfer or approved another grant for a youth emergency center, he saw not spreadsheets, but cold church basements, aching hunger, and one brave girl kneeling by a fence with half her lunch in her hands. Not everyone thought Birmingham was a wise place to reopen old wounds. Daniel Mercer, known to most as Dan, had been Malik's closest business partner for 8 years. Dan was white, polished, practical, and gifted at turning emotional decisions into financial warnings. On the flight south, he studied the proposal packet and finally said, "You have enough power now to do this anywhere. Why go back there? And why touch race in a city that still doesn't know how to talk about it honestly?" Malik stared out the window for a long moment before answering. "Because that city talked about race just fine when it needed to use it against me." Dan sighed and warned him that local politicians would smile in public, then bury him if he pushed too hard. Malik heard the warning. He also heard the fear underneath it, the same fear respectable people always disguised as strategy. When Malik arrived in Birmingham, he did not begin with the mayor's office or the cameras. He began with a drive through the old neighborhoods. What he found hardened something inside him. Block after block of longtime black communities had been hollowed out under the banner of redevelopment. Family-owned shops were gone. Churches sat boarded up. Elderly residents were being pressured out through rising taxes, zoning shifts, and buyout offers dressed up as opportunity. Fresh signs promised luxury living where ordinary people had built lives for generations. Revitalization, the billboards called it. Malik knew a cleaner word when he saw one. Erasure. By the time his car turned back toward downtown, his 2 reasons for returning no longer felt separate. Finding Emily mattered. So did confronting the system that had once taught a hungry black boy exactly how cheaply his life could be valued. This time, Malik Carter had money, power, and a name the city could not ignore. Emily Harper had grown into exactly the kind of woman Birmingham made necessary. At 29, she was a community attorney with a calm voice, sharp mind, and a reputation for standing in rooms full of power without flinching. She worked out of a modest legal aid office on the West Side, representing low-income tenants, elderly homeowners, and black families squeezed out of neighborhoods their grandparents had built. Emily was still small and fair, but the softness of childhood had turned into a steadier kind of strength. Her blonde hair was usually pinned back in a practical twist, and she carried herself with the quiet certainty of someone who no longer needed permission to speak. When the city announced a public meeting about Malik Carter's redevelopment initiative, Emily showed up, not because she wanted a fight, but because she had seen too many projects arrive with promises and leave with evictions. The auditorium at Carver Community Center was packed that evening. Residents filled the folding chairs, ministers, shop owners, teachers, and anxious tenants lined the walls. At the back stood Noah Harper, Emily's older brother, now a Birmingham police officer in his early 30s. Noah had broad shoulders, a tired face, and the heavy silence of a man who had spent years slowly realizing how much of his childhood had been built out of things he should never have believed. He was not there in uniform. He came because Emily had asked him to listen, and because the words he once threw around so casually about boys like Malik had begun to echo inside him differently now. On stage, city officials praised opportunity. They spoke of economic growth, housing access, and revitalization, as if those words had never been used to clear poor black families out of their own streets. Ava Bennett was there too, notebook in hand, sitting 3 rows from the front. Ava, a black investigative journalist with keen eyes and a relentless gift for spotting what powerful people hoped others would miss, had been digging into Mayor Clayton Reed's office for months. Reed was polished, media-savvy, and skilled at disguising racial favoritism in the language of progress. Ava suspected that several redevelopment contracts tied to his administration had quietly favored wealthy white investors while displacing black homeowners and renters block by block. Tonight, she had come to watch Malik Carter up close. She wanted to know whether he was simply another polished face attached to an old machine, or something far more dangerous to it. When Malik stepped to the microphone, the room changed. He was taller than Emily expected, broad-shouldered now, elegant in a navy suit that fit like power. His voice was controlled, persuasive, built for investors and cameras. Yet the moment Emily saw him, she felt something she could not name, some strange pull between familiarity and distance. Malik began outlining the project: renovated housing, commercial space for local business, vocational programs, digital access, youth services. The language was polished, careful, impressive. But Emily had spent too many years reading between elegant lines. When questions opened, she stood before she could second-guess herself. "How many current residents," she asked, "can afford to stay once the property values rise? And how many black families are expected to leave before your promises begin to matter?" The room went still. Malik looked up and froze. In that instant, before reason caught up, he knew. Not from her face alone, though he could see traces of the girl she had been. He knew from the way she stood firm under scrutiny, from the same steady defiance she once carried to a fence with half a sandwich in her hand. Emily did not know why the billionaire in front of her had gone silent. She only knew he was staring at her as if she had stepped out of a grave. The pause stretched long enough for murmurs to ripple across the room. Then Malik answered, but his voice had changed. It was softer now, less rehearsed. "That's a fair question," he said, though his eyes never left her. Emily pressed further, naming streets, citing displacement figures, forcing him to answer specifics. Instead of bristling, Malik listened, truly listened. And as she challenged him line by line, Malik felt something he had not expected: pride. Emily was exactly what a frightened little boy outside a school fence would have needed her to become: fierce, decent, unafraid. She had not become smaller to survive Birmingham. She had sharpened. After the meeting ended, Noah caught up with Emily near the side hallway. "You were right to push him," he said quietly. Emily blinked at him, surprised by the humility in his tone. Noah rubbed the back of his neck. "I used to say things when we were kids, things I didn't understand. Hearing all this, tonight..." He trailed off, ashamed. Emily looked at her brother for a long moment, and saw not the boy who had once repeated ugly ideas, but a man trying to step away from them. Before she could answer, Malik appeared at the end of the corridor. Up close, he looked less untouchable and more human, more tired somehow. "Emily Harper?" he said. She nodded cautiously. He took one step closer. "Do you remember a school fence, a sandwich, and a little black boy who promised he'd come back rich and marry you?" The world seemed to drop out from under her. Emily stared at him, every sound around them fading to nothing. Then her hand flew to her throat, as if it could still feel the missing half of a star. Emily could barely feel her hands after Malik spoke those words in the hallway. The world around them had become muffled, distant, unreal. She led him into a small counseling room beside the legal aid office, closed the door, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. Up close, the past was suddenly everywhere, in the shape of his eyes, in the careful way he watched her, in the ache that rose in her chest when she realized the hungry boy outside the fence had truly lived long enough to become this man. Malik stood with both hands at his sides, as if afraid that one wrong move might shatter the moment. Then, quietly, he said, "I remembered you every day of my life." Emily's eyes filled at once. She pressed a hand to her mouth, then shook her head with a broken laugh. "I never forgot you either," she whispered. "I just didn't know if you were alive." Once the first shock passed, the truth came out in pieces. Malik sat across from her and told her what had happened after he was taken away. He had moved through foster placements, shelters, temporary homes, and institutions that called themselves help, while teaching him how little protection the world offered boys like him. He told her about being 12 and followed through a grocery store by a security guard who watched him like theft had already happened, about being 14 and thrown out of a convenience store because the owner said, "Kids like you scare customers," about being stopped outside a pharmacy with his backpack searched because someone claimed he looked suspicious. Malik did not raise his voice when he said these things, which somehow made them hurt more. "Being hungry was bad," he said, staring at his clasped hands. "But being looked at like I was dirty, dangerous, less than human, that did something worse." Emily sat frozen, grief moving across her face as she realized that what she once saw as a child's small kindness had been, for Malik, a reason to keep believing he deserved to survive. She told him then what she had carried all these years, how, after he was taken away, she had gone to the fence every day for 2 weeks anyway, still hoping she would see him, how she had hidden the half-star pendant in a jewelry box beneath old ribbons and birthday cards, how every time she passed a boy sleeping near a bus station or watched city officials talk about cleaning up neighborhoods, she thought of him. "I kept wondering if you were cold," she admitted, "or hungry, or if somebody was finally kind to you." Malik looked at her with an expression so raw it almost undid her. "Nobody was kind the way you were," he said. Then he smiled faintly through the heaviness. "Not once." The silence that followed was not empty. It was full of all the years they had lost, and all the tenderness that somehow had not died inside either of them. Outside that room, another kind of truth was taking shape. Ava Bennett had spent weeks chasing records through city offices, property transfers, shell companies, zoning approvals, and campaign donations. That night, she called Emily with the edge of victory in her voice. She had found documents linking Mayor Clayton Reed to investors who had quietly bought up historic black neighborhoods through intermediaries before redevelopment plans were announced. Tax pressure, code violations, selective rezoning, predatory buyouts. It had all been coordinated. Public improvement was merely the language used to hide displacement. Ava sent over maps, contracts, and emails showing that the city had effectively been clearing out longtime black residents to make room for wealthier newcomers. It was not mismanagement. It was design. And now there was paper to prove it. For the first time in years, Noah Harper chose not just to feel ashamed, but to act. Working carefully from inside the system, he started flagging incidents Emily had long suspected but never been able to document. Patterns in eviction enforcement, selective police presence during property clearances, internal memos showing city coordination with private developers during neighborhood transitions. Noah was not a hero, and he knew it. But he was finally becoming useful. When he handed Emily a file and said, "I should have seen this sooner," she understood that his guilt was real. It did not erase the boy he had been, but it marked the man he was trying to become. For Emily, that mattered. For Malik, it was one more sign that people could still choose differently than the world had trained them to. 2 days later, Malik drove alone to the old church where Pastor James Holloway still preached on Sundays. The building looked smaller than he remembered, but the warmth inside it hadn't changed. Pastor James, now slower in his walk and silver at the temples, recognized Malik before he spoke. He welcomed him with the same steady kindness he had once offered a freezing child in a basement cot. When Malik told him what was happening, the city, Emily, the corruption, the anger still living inside him, Pastor James listened without interruption. Then he rested one hand on Malik's shoulder and said, "Son, survival is one kind of victory, but the greater one is this. Take what was meant to break you and use it to build something they can't destroy." Malik lowered his head, absorbing the words like medicine. By the time he left the church, the pain of the past had not lessened. But it had direction now. And that changed everything. Clayton Reed had spent his entire career mastering the art of respectable theft. As mayor of Birmingham, he wore polished suits, quoted scripture when cameras were near, and spoke about renewal as though progress were a gift he alone could grant. So when he announced a public hearing on the future of the redevelopment district, he expected Malik Carter to stand beside him as proof that the city was finally changing. Reed believed Malik's name, his money, and his carefully built image would help legitimize a plan designed to finish what quieter policies had already begun: the removal of black families from land their roots ran deep in. What Reed did not understand was that Malik had stopped trying to be acceptable to people like him the moment he saw the city's true map, one paved over the lives of the poor and painted over with the language of opportunity. By noon, the steps of City Hall were packed. Residents from the threatened neighborhood stood shoulder to shoulder with pastors, retirees, shop owners, students, and reporters. Television crews circled like birds, waiting for spectacle. Emily Harper stood near the front in a charcoal suit, files in hand, controlled but burning inside. Ava Bennett, calm and sharp behind her notebook, had already arranged for copies of the evidence to be distributed to 3 major newsrooms the moment the hearing began. Noah Harper waited off to one side, his jaw tight, holding a sealed envelope that had cost him 2 sleepless nights and the last of his excuses. When Malik arrived, the crowd fell into a hush. He looked less like a businessman that day and more like a verdict in motion, measured, composed, impossible to dismiss. Reed welcomed him with a politician's smile, one hand outstretched for the cameras. Malik never took it. When the hearing opened, Reed began exactly as expected. He praised growth, investment, jobs, safety, modernization. He spoke of blight as though poor black neighborhoods had decayed by choice. He called displacement transition. He called demolition reimagining. Then he introduced Malik Carter as living proof that Birmingham rewards resilience. The phrase hung in the air like an insult wearing perfume. Malik approached the microphone slowly, and for a moment, the whole square seemed to hold its breath. "You want me to be your proof?" he said. "Then let me tell this city what it really rewarded." His voice did not shake. He told them about the school fence, the hunger, the winter, the stores that watched him like a criminal before he ever touched a shelf, the adults who saw a poor black boy and decided he was trouble before he spoke a single word. Cameras turned toward him. Reporters stopped scribbling and simply listened. Then Malik said the sentence that split the day open. "What almost killed me wasn't just hunger," he said. "It was contempt. It was being looked at like I was less than human so often that I nearly started believing it myself." The words landed with the force of confession and indictment all at once. A woman in the crowd began to cry. An old man removed his cap and held it against his chest. Reed tried to interrupt, but the crowd turned on him with such visible disgust that even he understood the moment was slipping away. Malik went on. He named the neighborhood where he had slept outside. He named the church basement where Pastor James had sheltered him. He named the little white girl who fed him through a fence when respectable adults looked away. And then he said, with cold precision, "So no, Mayor Reed, you do not get to use my success to erase the people you are still trying to erase." Emily stepped forward next, and if Malik's speech had cracked Reed's armor, hers broke it open. She laid out the facts in ruthless sequence: property transfers, rezoning patterns, targeted tax assessments, code enforcement spikes, and selective demolition approvals that hit Black neighborhoods with mathematical cruelty. Every time Reed tried to shift the argument into abstractions, Emily dragged it back to names, addresses, families, timelines. "You call this revitalization," she said, holding up a file thick with records. "I call it engineered removal." Reed attempted charm, then outrage, then legal jargon. Emily dismantled each move before it could settle. By the time she finished, he looked less like a mayor and more like a man desperately searching for a script that no longer fit the room. Behind her, Ava signaled to the press pool, and packets began moving hand to hand like sparks. Then Noah Harper crossed the line he had spent years avoiding. He stepped to the microphone and placed the sealed envelope on the table in front of the ethics panel. Inside were internal memos, enforcement directives, and communication logs that had never been meant for public view. Records showing police coordination during property clearances, selective response instructions, and city pressure applied to holdout residents. Noah's voice was rough when he spoke. "These were buried," he said. "They shouldn't have been." Reed stared at him as if betrayal had a shape. Ava's evidence proved corruption. Emily's argument proved intent. Noah's files proved system. The effect was immediate. Two state investigators who had been standing near the rear entrance moved toward the stage the moment the final document was projected on the public screen. Someone in the crowd shouted, then many voices joined in. When Clayton Reed was placed in handcuffs on the steps of City Hall, the sound that rose around him was not chaos. It was release. No one looked at Malik Carter the way they once had. Not anymore. As Reed was led away beneath flashing cameras and furious headlines, the crowd turned toward Malik with something far deeper than admiration. Some saw justice. Some saw survival. Some saw every Black child the city had ever dismissed standing upright in one man's body. A grandmother from the West End reached for his hand and whispered, "You made them hear us." Across the plaza, Emily met Malik's eyes, and in that moment, the city seemed to understand what she had known first. He had never been the threat. He had been the truth they feared. And now that truth stood in daylight, unashamed and undeniable, while all of Birmingham watched in stunned silence before breaking into cheers. A year later, Birmingham looked different. Not because the city had suddenly grown a conscience, but because people who had once been ignored were finally holding power in plain sight. The grand opening of Star Promise House drew more people than anyone expected. Built on restored land that developers once tried to strip from the neighborhood, the center stood as living proof that repair could be louder than ruin. It offered emergency housing, legal aid, counseling, job placement, and mentorship for homeless youth, with special priority given to Black teenagers the system had pushed aside and punished for surviving badly. Malik Carter stood at the entrance in a dark suit, no longer the starving boy outside a fence, but not pretending he had ever stopped being him either. The sign above the doors gleamed in the sun, and for the first time in his life, Birmingham had to look at something built from his pain that did not belong to them. It belonged to the children coming after him. Emily Harper had become one of the center's founding voices. As legal counsel for the Star Promise Foundation, she made sure the institution was not just compassionate, but protected. Written into contracts, land trusts, and city obligations, no future administration could quietly unravel. She moved through the building with the same steady purpose she had once carried into hostile hearings. But now there was lightness in her, too. A peace earned rather than borrowed. In one office, teenagers met caseworkers who actually knew their names. In another, volunteer tutors sat with kids who had spent years being told to expect less from life. Noah Harper now ran the center's youth outreach and safety program, working long nights and weekends with boys who reminded him of how easily society decides who matters. He never called it redemption out loud. He simply showed up, again and again, as if consistency itself could become apology. Before the ceremony began, Rose Harper found Malik alone near the hallway lined with framed photographs of the center's first residents. Rose looked older than she had a year ago, but there was something cleaner in her face now, something unburdened by pretending. She folded her hands before speaking. "I owe you an apology," she said. Malik turned toward her, silent. Rose swallowed hard. "Back then, I told myself fear was wisdom. I told myself caution was how I protected my daughter. But the truth is, I let fear speak louder than courage. And you were just a boy." Malik held her gaze for a long moment. Then he nodded once. "You let Emily help me," he said quietly. Rose's eyes filled. "Emily was braver than I was." Malik gave her a faint, tired smile. "She still is." When Rose stepped forward and embraced him, it did not erase the past, but it honored the truth of it, and sometimes that was the beginning of grace. The dedication ceremony felt less like a ribbon cutting and more like a public act of restoration. Ava Bennett, now nationally recognized after winning a major journalism award for exposing the corruption behind Birmingham's redevelopment scandal, stood near the stage with her camera crew and a smile she rarely gave freely. Pastor James Holloway offered the blessing. His voice, still deep and grounding, carried over the crowd as he thanked God not for easy endings, but for justice that had finally learned to walk through the front door. He blessed the children who would sleep safely under that roof, the families who had stayed, and the two souls whose story had lit the path there. Malik bowed his head. Emily stood beside him, her hand brushing his for just a second. Around them were city residents, former clients, pastors, teachers, kids from the first youth cohort, and even men who once would not have dared stand so publicly behind a project like this. Birmingham had not become perfect, but it had been forced to become honest. That evening, after the crowd thinned and the last news van pulled away, Malik asked Emily to take a drive with him. He said very little on the way, and she did not press. Some silences had their own language. When he parked beside the old schoolyard, Emily felt her breath catch before she even stepped out. The fence was still there. New paint, repaired posts, but the same outline against the dusk. The same place where a hungry black boy had once stood, with cracked lips and frightened eyes. Malik reached into his pocket and took out the half-star pendant he had carried for 20 years. Emily slowly pulled the other half from the chain around her neck. He smiled then, not the controlled public smile of a businessman, but the unguarded one of the boy who had once believed impossible things because she had fed him. Holding out the broken silver piece, he said, "One day, I'll come back rich, and I'll marry you." This time, Emily did not laugh. Tears rose in her eyes, but her voice never shook. "Yes," she said. "Yes, Malik, I'll marry you." He slid the restored star, now newly set in a ring box beneath the pendant halves, into her hand, and Emily cried the way people cry when something lost for too long finally comes home. Malik drew her close, forehead resting against hers as the old fence stood behind them, like a witness that had waited long enough. He had come back rich, yes, but richer in ways the city could never measure. He had returned with honor instead of bitterness, with justice instead of revenge, with a house full of hope for children no one else wanted to see, and with a love that had outlived shame, distance, and time. Somewhere across Birmingham, lights glowed in rooms that once would have gone dark. At Star Promise House, young people were unpacking bags into safe bedrooms. Noah was locking the front doors after another long night. Ava was filing the final line of a story the city would never forget. Pastor James was whispering one more prayer, and at the old school fence, the poor black boy everyone rejected had finally kept his promise. And in the end, maybe this was God's plan all along. A poor black boy the world looked down on, and one little white girl, brave enough to love with kindness instead of fear. Racism teaches people to divide, but God teaches us to love. He does not look at skin color. He looks at the heart. So I want to ask you, what do you see first when you look at someone? Leave your thoughts in the comments. And if this story moved you, please like this video and subscribe to the channel for more emotional and inspiring stories.